It has been over 6 years since this game was released. And tell me that music doesn't still do it for you. Doesn't fill you with an intense desire to start playing this game all over again. I uploaded the first video for my Wild Hunt series on August 9th, 2016, a little over 15 months after the game itself was released. And 4.5 years later, on March 23rd, 2021, I uploaded the final installment and marked my playlist completed, with a large feeling of accomplishment and a gigantic pang of regret that the Wild Hunt was over. 4.5 years for one series, 178 episodes, and what is most likely over 300 hours of gameplay. All recorded in various ways, including an initial failed attempt to stream 1080p to Twitch and YouTube, and only succeeding in achieving 480p, if that. All recorded on 3 separate machines, at first a vanilla PS4, and then a PS4 Pro, and finally through a Blackmagic 4K capture card installed on my old DIY gaming rig, which had 2 SLI'd GTX 760s, and which has since been replaced by my first water-cooled build with a monster NVIDIA RTX 3090 GPU. That new gaming PC, which I assembled back in January, and have given the name Orthanc, will be used to record a Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine series. More on that later in this review video. You probably missed all those console and PC specs because you're still trying to wrap your head around someone spending 4.5 years on one game and gaming series. Or you're still doubled over from laughter. Fine, laugh it up, fuzzball. But I will simply never understand the rush to complete games with massive worlds like The Witcher 3, Wild Hunt. Has The Witcher 4, or whatever the sequel will ultimately be called, been released yet? So why the frantic panic to get to the end of this game in such a hurry, when you're going nowhere? Anyone who watches my gaming series knows I am, at heart, a fairly obsessive RPG grinder. That is my gaming wheelhouse and background, so a game as great as The Witcher 3 will always remain a multi-year odyssey on my channel. And I totally get it if that seems absurd to you and is not your thing. Pretty much everyone these days puts a lot of stock in things happening and ending really fast, no matter what kind of game we're talking about. For whatever borderline ADHD reason, that seems to be the case anymore. By the way, it took me much less time to finish it the second time on PC, maybe 6 or 7 months, because I was not recording, editing, and uploading as I was with the PS4 Pro series. And FYI, I spend much more time editing and rendering a series than I do playing it, especially when it is 4K and possibly 60 frames per second, which I actually didn't achieve with the PS4 Pro and The Witcher 3. I believe CD Projekt Red claims that they released an update for the PS4 Pro to bring the game to 60 frames per second, but I never got that. I got somewhere maybe around 35 frames per second at most. But anyway, yeah, I've already played it from start to finish twice. And you may be wondering why I did that. That's because PS4 game saves are not transferable to PC. They don't even have the same extensions or file name format. And as mentioned, I will be recording a Hearts of Stone and a Blood and Wine series on PC. So obviously I needed to complete the Wild Hunt on PC first before being able to do that. Okay, all that personal and channel info preamble aside, I honestly don't know how to structure this review because I feel like almost everything has been said about this game. It's probably not going to have much of a structure as a result and will be a bit of a ramble. which hopefully raises some unique points no one else has in their own reviews. I'll be honest that I haven't watched many of them, maybe a few here and there. So there is a chance of overlap that might seem like pilfering. Honestly, this is all fresh out of my head without peeking at anyone else's test paper. And I'm actually going to try to criticize and find faults in this game during this review. That's right, I'm going to try to point out flaws in what is arguably the greatest game ever. Let me know how unsuccessful or futile the effort was in the comments. Oh, and spoilers galore ahead, obviously, so if you're the one person who hasn't played it yet or finished it, what the heck are you doing here? Scram, or don't complain if you stick around. Thank you very much. Also, because I want to keep this as one of a kind and interesting as possible, some of my critiques of the game will touch on things that are admittedly beyond the control of CD Projekt Red devs, because the subject matter addressed is integral to the root stories found in the books. I suppose they could have changed things for the games, but why would they do that? Okay, so let's finally get started here with how beautiful the Wild Hunt is. It is such a willfully theatrical game designed to give you the feeling of watching Geralt's life story unfold before your eyes. That water droplet dappling the camera lens is even simulated. I'm sure this escaped no one, but I just want to bring it up to drive the point home. This game was meant to knock your socks off back in 2015 with its immersive look and feel. And I think it largely achieved that. Most people fell in love with the high quality production behind The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt because the graphics dragged them in at first, and then all the incredible voice acting and great character creation held on to them after that initial wow graphics factor might have subsided, which it always does with games with great graphics. Eventually, the gimmick sort of wears off, but you never really lose the appreciation for it. That said, I have heard from a friend of mine that games from the same time period, like Red Dead Redemption 2, surpass it from a graphics perspective. I haven't played it myself, but I don't think it's impossible that that is indeed the case. And I have to say, now that I've played Cyberpunk 2077 with a high-end GPU like the RTX 3090 allowing for ultra settings, when I play The Witcher 3, I do notice the glaring lack of ray tracing. That is something that the sequel will obviously have to incorporate, but again, more on that later. Even though I'm not a big graphics gamer, I'll play pretty much anything out there as long as it's got decent gameplay. Doesn't have to wow me, doesn't have to make my eyes bulge out of my head. And even though I still retro game a lot of dinosaur IPs, I look forward to visiting a Novigrad or Oxenfurt or some city like them at night in the rain with intense shadowing and flickering torchlight reflecting off the wet cobblestone streets and so on. That, I have to admit, will be pretty amazing if they go there for the sequel to The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. What more can be said about the superb voice acting in this game? Every last character seems to have the perfect and appropriate voice, and it really lends to the immersion and believability. Even characters like Yen, that are intended to get on your nerves all the time, just simply work because they are so well done and professionally voice acted. Yen is, frankly, the biggest bitch in the Northern Kingdoms, and you end up accepting that as a fact of Geralt's life because she seems so earnest and real in her irritating bitchiness, for lack of a better way to put it. She is who she is to you as someone playing this game because, again, she's so well done. That said, let's take a moment to talk about what sorceresses in this game actually are, because I find them rather odd and in some ways disturbing. They are, if we are to believe what we're told, old hags who have transformed themselves into young beauties using magic. This is nothing new in fantasy fiction or folktales, of course. Witches are doing this all the time in familiar fables, but they are depicted as inherently evil for doing so and using the ability for evil goals 99% of the time. This, however, is not the case in the Witcher stories, or at least not to the same degree. To be sure, the Yennefer in the books manipulates people with her good looks and is up to all kinds of self-serving schemes, such as the trapping of a djinn to increase her own power, which nearly ends up leveling an entire town. And there's some of that to be found in the Yennefer of the Wild Hunt and in other sorceresses like Kira Metz as well, but it is definitely not the case with someone as kind and sweet as Triss, for example. Triss is depicted as an almost unrealistically nice, pretty, and idyllic girlfriend. Yet she too, if we are to believe the legends we are told, is an old hag who transformed herself. If she is indeed such a magnanimous and genuine person, and let's just throw it out there, a better match for Geralt than Yen, then why is she also living such an outright shallow lie? And like witchers, sorceresses are sterile. Yet some of them, like Philippa and Coral, we are told become romantically involved with normal men of nobility. Men you would assume are faced with social pressure to marry into other aristocratic families and to produce offspring in order to maintain order and peace throughout the realm. It is one thing for infertile witchers like Geralt and Lambert to become love interests for these sorceresses, and maybe it is even, quote, natural, unquote, if that's the right word, for them to do so, given the circumstances of the world they inhabit and how both classes of individuals are outcasts and might find themselves interacting quite often since they can't interact with others. But it does seem strange that a transformed hag, barren at that, and not terribly different from the crones when all is said and done, would be sexually mingling with the Gentiles, or, quote, normies, unquote, let's call them, without some mob hunting them down with torches and pitchforks for the deception. There is something that begs for an explanation in all of that, but again, that is something that has been carried over into the game from the books. So it's really not a criticism of the developers per se, just something that causes me, and maybe me alone, to scratch my head a bit. No, I'm not clueless or senile or something, so yeah, I remember all the Salem witch trial seeming stuff that went on with the Church of the Eternal Fire and Radovid and his goons, but I doubt their indiscretions with noblemen or noblewomen was the root cause of that brutal violence. That was pretty much strictly a show of political power, and in Radovid's case, due to a personal vendetta and his poor mental health. And I will discuss the transitioning to targeting non-humans after the sorcerers and sorceresses and magic users and such had sort of left the scene in Novigrad later in this video. And apropos of nothing, what is up with every woman, witch or not a witch, having the same birthmark on her back? Anyone who watched my series probably knows that Hjalmar was my favorite character. For what may seem like a really weird reason, that back when I was playing standalone multiplayer Gwent online, his card, combined with another called Combi, which I started calling the chicken card, and some Dimeridium bomb cards and such, became integral to my Skellige deck and contributed to the only somewhat lasting winning streak I ever experienced playing that game. I say somewhat because I no sooner reached a better than 500 winning percentage with this odd tactic, and Gwent devs released a patch which totally nerfed my deck. I mean, it really seemed like they specifically released an update which targeted my deck and my deck alone. I know I sound paranoid, and yes, I'll eventually get over this, I think. Anyway, I was playing this deck well before I had reached Skellige in the Wild Hunt gameplay, so I was pretty excited to get to the point where you could actually travel there, to Skellige that is. And then I kind of screwed up my wish to make Hjalmar king, but you'll have to watch the series to see how that happened. That said, even though Hjalmar was my favorite, I have to say one of the best, if not the best characters in the game is Dijkstra. The voice actor really nails him, and the character is one of the most interesting in the game, if you ask me. He is, of course, an underworld figure when you meet him, but he has a background as a spy and a advisor to kings, and he's a larger-than-life presence who steals pretty much every scene he's in, even from Geralt, the protagonist of the game. At one point, even Geralt seems surprised by how much preternatural knowledge Dijkstra seems to have about everything going on in Novigrad, Velen, Nilfgaard, pretty much anywhere in the world they inhabit. I myself began to wonder if we were going to learn Dijkstra might have been hiding his power levels and was using magic of some kind or some sort of divination power to know all the things he knows. Okay, so why am I bringing all of this up when we've already established the impressive nature of the characters? Well, I was really disappointed when the game backed me into a corner and basically made me kill him. It came down to a choice between saving Roach and Vess, who had helped me, or saving Dijkstra, who is a selfish individual, obviously, and did not help me. I kind of felt like that was a bit of a betrayal on the part of the devs of a character they put so much time and effort into making likable and real. Now, I've read the Game of Thrones books, so I'm no stranger to important characters dropping like flies. And even within the Witcher universe, I experienced the pretty jarring loss of Geralt's friend and a bigger than life personality in the Bloody Baron, and Vesemir's cruel execution, essentially, at Imlerith's hands. But all of those I could accept somehow more easily than what happened with Dijkstra. There was something that seemed so sudden and unnecessary about it, and about that final confrontation with him, that it just didn't sit well with me. I have to admit, however, that I haven't finished the Witcher books yet, and I don't know what happens to him in them, so no spoilers, please, regarding the books, even though there's spoilers in this video. So maybe once again, this is a case of the devs not having much of a choice if they wanted to stay loyal to the stories in the books. The foster father and daughter relationship between Geralt and Ciri very easily could have gotten incredibly soppy and melodramatic, but I can't remember a time when it felt that way. There were, of course, goofy moments, but they served as decent tension breakers and gave you the sense that Geralt and Ciri's lives together involved at least some joy and good times, and were totally filled with rigorous Witcher training and mortal dangers and constant struggle. And I got legitimately choked up during the two most critical scenes with Ciri on the Isle of Mists and in the final sequence between Geralt and her when Geralt has to say goodbye to her. The emotions they elicited say a lot about how successful this game was in making you, the player, care nearly every bit as much about her as Geralt, the main character, is supposed to. But I'll get more into how the game ropes you into careful decision making with regards to Ciri in the section about the different endings of the game. There is something so natural and familiar about Geralt and him being the protagonist of this game and him being the character you control for this game. There's really no one else you could control in this game. Now, of course, he's, again, the protagonist. He's the prominent figure in the books, so he would be in the game as well. But of all the characters, you seem to instinctively get who and what he is and the role he plays in his world right from the start, right from the get-go. He is, you can tell, a no-nonsense straight shooter. Even in that beginning sequence where he and Vesemir are trying to make sense of what happened to Yen during the battle, you just get the sense that he's not messing around in any way, shape, or form. He simply wants to do his job and get through his day, eliminate the monsters threatening the local peasantry with as little intrigue and difficulty as possible. Of course, everyone else wants the exact opposite to happen, hence the underlying, ever-present conflict in Geralt's life. As Gels called him, he is a man of action. And that's really what he is, when you get down to brass tacks here. Now, he's far from normal, being a Witcher and all, but given all the exceptional people that surround him, he is really sort of working class and blue collar, relatively speaking. And all of that mumbo jumbo aside, he's just freaking cool. When you play this game, you really want to be Geralt, despite the incredible cortisol producing dangers of his profession and existence, or maybe exactly because of them. I have to say, in the annals of legendary fantasy figures, he ranks right up there with Fingolfin, or Aragorn, or Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, or Conan, or Ned Stark, or whoever you can think of. I'm pretty sure there are now many Geralts written into the name field of desktop RPG player character sheets. I think that's a fairly safe bet. But unlike Aragorn or Fingolfin or Fafhrd and Grey Mouser, there is a distinctly modern edge to Geralt's swagger and coolness. So if I were to pick a fictional character I think he most reminds me of, and this may sound crazy, but it would be the man with no name from the good, the bad, and the ugly. Now, again, you might think that's a very strange choice, but they both engage in some rather morally ambiguous behavior. Geralt has to for his job, and the man with no name does so because he is invested in himself, most of all. They're both men of very few and particularly gravelly words, let's say, and they are both legendary and mythical figures. Yes, many gunslingers in films like Sergio Leone's spaghetti western trilogy were in fact playing their part in the myth building surrounding the American frontier in the late 1800s. And often the feats they achieved with their weapons were every bit as supernatural as what Geralt does with his signs and his magical swords. The difference, of course, is that Geralt is operating on the behalf of another, Ciri, whereas the man with no name is strictly in it for himself. But there still is a little bit of that in Geralt because he takes out contracts on monsters to swell his own coin sack. And both of them pretty much will do anything necessary to attain their objectives, distinct though they may be. And perhaps the most important part of this game's production value is the near total lack of bleeding heart politics worked into the storyline and gameplay. Now, there certainly are hints of it to be found in the racial tension between humans and non-humans, but it is mostly avoidable backdrop that Geralt doesn't have to interact with, and both sides are rendered more or less equally culpable in the end by dialogue and interactions between Geralt and members of the Ainel like Avallac'h and Eredin. Will CD Projekt Red be able to hold its ground on contentious, quote, woke, unquote, issues, remain on the side of sanity, that is, on our side, and keep purple-haired, obese minority pansexuals out of future versions of the game? I have my doubts because of things I'm seeing in Cyberpunk 2077, but I will wait until I finish that game before making any definitive statements. And there's always the fact that a future dystopia lends itself to the adoption of absurd modern politics more readily than a medieval setting does. So maybe the Witcher series will always remain one of the few refreshing oases in a wasteland of games that seem intentionally designed to insult your intelligence and ruin your immersion. There is good reason to hope so, anyway. In my humble opinion, this will always be the Achilles heel of all third-person, main character-driven games like The Witcher 3. Production and voice acting will forever take priority over gameplay, and almost have to, by definition, through no fault of the devs. That is not to say that melee and traveling throughout the world and interacting with NPCs and finding loot and the quests and so on were not incredibly enjoyable. But leveling and provisioning one main character will forever fall short of controlling and crafting an entire party of very different individuals, for old school RPGers like me anyway, especially when you cannot even choose the one character's class. Some people may like the fact that he is a Witcher, and you are locked into that choice. Maybe it simplifies things for them. But for me, it always falls a bit short of what I'm looking for in an open world RPG. So I'm wondering if CD Projekt Red is working on that for the sequel, or if it will be more Geralt-only control. Of course, you get to play as Ciri as well, but you don't do any leveling or attribute enhancement with her. She didn't even have an inventory to choose a different weapon from. What I see as a nice place for The Witcher 4, let's call it for a lack of a better title, to go would be choosing a party and classes. Maybe being able to select thief-like spy characters and craft your own taller, and sorceresses and mages, and straight-up soldiers or fighters and so on. You should be able to choose those as well, maybe. Of course, Geralt would be the party leader, so maybe it could just be a team of several Witchers that you could individually level and provision, because I really miss that aspect of typical RPG gameplay with the Wild Hunt. But again, maybe that's just me. Now, I hear a lot of complaining, let's say. It's more like criticism or hopes and wants and wishes in reviews about the limits of game engine mechanics presently, and not just for The Witcher 3. For instance, many Skyrim players are hoping Elder Scrolls 6 will have a whole new engine where you can actually climb walls and cliffs rather than jump rolling up or down them. There's a lot of that in The Witcher 3, too, where Geralt ends up rolling up a mountainside to get over it or whatever. And the snowboarding down the other side was a neat addition, I will say. But maybe not always the most natural feeling activity for Geralt. He also does do some straight up climbing, of course. But that is when obvious ledges have been coded into the local surroundings, or cave passage, or dungeon, or sewer tunnel, or whatever you're traveling through with many tiered levels to it. I get how this unnatural movement can seem forced and break immersion for some players, but something that bothered me much more was not being able to share loot with other characters, because, as I have admitted many times, I am a loot focused player. That's what I'm doing. I'm exploring every last nook and cranny of the world I'm in to find every last bit of loot and make sure I'm using the best possible equipment. That's just how I go about these games. So I'm wondering, why did I have to sell or stick in my stash swords that weren't quite as good as what I was using? Why couldn't I have given them to Lambert or Eskel or Vesemir to upgrade their melee skills? And could that have been something that might have turned the tide in critical and pivotal battles within the game, like what happened to Kaer Morhen? Could their use of better equipment even have saved Vesemir's life? You don't need a whole new game engine to include such features in your game. You just need to tweak the design a bit. On a lighter note, and something this game doesn't get much credit for, is it is legitimately laugh out loud funny sometimes. As mentioned, Geralt is fairly no nonsense and a man of few words, but that doesn't preclude him from having a tongue as sharp as his swords every now and then. And this game did not shy away from outright silly and absurdist humor occasionally, which, at the risk of sounding all too easily entertained, is right up my alley.
What? Eat, you. Goulash of necrosis. Much onion.
How you like that silver?
Something about the game that is almost certainly my own pet peeve, and probably not something that bothers many other people. But I'm going to bring it up anyway because, well, because I am. Geralt's first set of armor was the coolest looking one he ever finds or uses or crafts. I found this really disappointing. Don't get me wrong, I liked all the bonuses his subsequent armor had, especially the vitality boosts I could never seem to part with, even when the armor rating of something else I found was much better. But a lot of it just seemed, I don't know, silly looking or goofy and not terribly inspired. Now, maybe there's something about medieval era Slavic armor that I need to be educated on in order to appreciate what I was looking at. But even then, I have to wonder why that beginning armor looks so cool, if everything else was a, quote, guess you had to be there in medieval Slavic lands, unquote, kind of thing. And finally, as far as gameplay goes, there still are a lot of weird bugs in The Witcher 3 that haven't been ironed out yet. I mean, all games kind of end up with unsolved problems of some kind, but there are quite a few of them in this one. Roach still does some really odd things and has trouble with rooftops, as we all know, and people not quite finding the place they should occupy or the surface they should be standing on, and a lot of weird mid-air floaty things still occur in the game. Given similar issues found in Cyberpunk 2077, starting to wonder if this isn't just a company-wide coding problem. One of my biggest complaints about this game, which again probably didn't get under the skin of many other people, seems to me to be the easiest to fix, and that was that Dandelion's quest descriptions or the character descriptions often seem to predict or foretell a future I hadn't experienced yet. This is not terribly complicated to repair. It just requires some text changes so that these spoilers don't ruin missions for players. I don't think I'm asking too much there. That's a quick fix in some text file somewhere. At least I assume it is. Hunters, hoping their support would allow her to survive a trek into Crookback Bog. Okay, don't remember her saying any of that. Sometimes character entries seem to be able to peer into the future a little bit. The other head scratcher for me was the anachronistic scientific language. I come from a philology-centered school of epic fantasy that meticulously checks word usage to make sure it's appropriate for the time period. In other words, I'm a Tolkien fan, and anyone else who is as well will also appreciate the painstaking vetting of words the professor employed to make sure his prose did not use language that would not have existed in the setting and era being depicted. So when I see terms like gene and even science itself, I start to feel like I'm experiencing a sci-fi story rather than a fantasy fiction tale. And terms like vaccine were centuries away and would not have been part of a medieval witch like Kira's lexicon. So I wish they had chosen verbiage like, I don't know, miasma research or what have you for that Fike Island quest. And Lara Doran's trait or inherited virtue or something like that rather than gene during that Avalok lab exploration. So, seeing as how I've already brought up Tolkien, I might as well talk about what I always watch for in fantasy books and games, and that's reference to the professor's works, being that he is kind of ground zero for this genre. And there weren't too many of them that I noticed in The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. In fact, there seemed to be a lot more homages to 1990s indie filmmaking than to events or people in Middle Earth. The most obvious one, though, when it comes to Tolkien references is Caranthir, who is one of Feanor's seven sons, and like Caranthir of the Silmarillion, the Caranthir of the Wild Hunt is quite a diabolical elf. So that tribute is a pretty clear one. Another that I may be stretching things a bit to draw is the werewolf Berum, with an M at the end, you encounter in one of the possible endings. Now that name is awfully close to Baron, with an N, of Baron and Luthien fame, and readers of the Silmarillion will remember that Baron disguised himself in the hide of the great werewolf sire Draugluin to approach Angband without being assailed. Could be coincidence, but it could be another way the game honored Tolkien. Just saying. Okay, so now that I brought up the endings while talking about Barum, let's get to them. If you watch my Witcher 3 series, you know I got one of the better endings. Geralt tricks Emir into thinking Ciri is dead, and the two of them ride off into the sunset, living a simple Witcher life together, which includes just living day to day and slaying monsters for coin, right? It's a happy ending because they've gotten away from the control and the intrigue of powerful people like Emir and like the Lodge of Sorceresses. That's all Ciri was looking for throughout the game. So if you get this ending, you give Ciri what she wanted most. Now, what you can't know, since I didn't record and upload it, is that during my replay of the Wild Hunt on PC, I purposefully made some different choices for Geralt so that I could experience different things I might have missed the first go round. And that definitely happened. I fought a very interesting Witcher who reminded me a bit of Lambert that I never encountered in the PS4 series. And I followed Hjalmar after the Berserkers turned the feast at Kertrolda into bloody mayhem, and he became ruler as a consequence in the second playthrough rather than Cerys. I did not kill Whoreson Jr. at his hideout, just to see how that would alter the story arc, if at all, and so on and so forth. I made different decisions, just to experience the different ways the game and the story would proceed and unfold. So keep that all in mind should you watch my Hearts of Stone and Blood and Wine series, and shame on you if you don't. There will be some significant differences between characters and circumstances in those Let's Plays and in my Wild Hunt series. Anyway, getting back to the endings, I thought for sure that as long as I made similar dialogue choices during that final sequence between Geralt and Avalok and Ciri, and those being the ones that didn't pressure her one way or the other but allowed her to make her own choices, that once again I would be riding off with Ciri into the Emperor-free sunset and celebrating her new career as a Witcher. And damn was I wrong. No matter how many times I reloaded the save right before Geralt walks up to the tower and Ciri steps into the tower, and no matter what I said to her, I kept ending up in the swamp, battling the one surviving crone, and then getting overwhelmed by pretty much every monster in Geralt's world. In other words, I kept getting the worst ending the game has to offer. And then it dawned on me that among my different actions and choices in this second playthrough were how I interacted with Ciri. I made a lot of contradictory dialogue selections to see if things would develop in other ways between her and Geralt, and sometimes just to save time to get to the end quicker so I could start the DLCs and start recording them. And here's the critical bit. Those options during interactions with Ciri that I went for the second time around caused Geralt to be rather dismissive with her, rather than indulging and encouraging her like an attentive, caring parent might. I didn't have the snowball fight with her at Kaer Morhen, and I didn't go with her to Hindarsfjall, to Barry Skjall, and so on. In other words, I was being the kind of father who doesn't have the time for her. So of course she had less will to live in the face of the white frost than she otherwise would have had I been a better parent to her. Now, she's an adult daughter, but still, it's obvious she looks up to Geralt every stage of the game. She wants him to advise her, to take part in her interactions with other characters, asking things of her, any chance she can get. So as you play this game, again, even though she's an adult, you still have to be her father figure and essentially her parent. Now, I suppose some people might fault the devs for what they see as being slightly vindictive like this and punishing you for not being that caring parent for Ciri. I mean, again, she's an adult, so it's arguable that she should find her own way to her own happy ending in life, let's say. But when it dawned on me, I totally got it and had this head slapping moment. I mean, the devs put an awful lot of time and effort into creating intriguing and believable characters. So it's no surprise that if you do not take an interest in one of the most important ones, if not the most important one, and choose your interactions with her in a callous manner rather than in a, I don't know, maybe this is too sappy to say, but a loving manner, they are not going to reward you with the happy fairy tale ending. Because, to put it in modern vernacular, you end up giving Ciri daddy issues. Is this a bit of megalomania and mind control on the part of the creators of The Witcher 3? Or is it fair for them to code such rewards into their game? I'm of a mind that the latter is true, and that it actually increases the charm and the depth and the player's enjoyment of The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt. In a way, it's another puzzle to crack, and it makes you examine yourself and your own humanity, if that's not too much of a stretch, while playing this game. It's another brilliant facet of this game, if you ask me. All right, everyone, that's it. That's all I have to say about The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, and I guess it was quite a lot in the end. Thanks once again for tuning in, and don't forget that I'll be starting a Hearts of Stone series quite soon. Also, be sure to check out the other ones I'm presently uploading, which is Cyberpunk 2077, and that is in 4K and 60 frames per second on YouTube anyway. On BitChute, I don't know. You tell me. In these reviews, I always ask, because I don't know what BitChute's best resolution is. So if anybody knows, tell me, what is BitChute's best resolution? What can you achieve on BitChute? If I were to try to upload these 4K Cyberpunk 2077 episodes, I know it would fail every time. I'm having a tough enough time getting a successful 720p upload with BitChute. So maybe that answers my question. But if you have more solid evidence than that, that there's some ceiling, whatever that ceiling is for resolution on BitChute, please let me know. Anyway, the other two series I'm uploading right now are retro gaming Let's Plays, Baldur's Gate and Vampire the Masquerade Redemption. Those are both old school RPGs, which are definitely not in 4K, but pretty awesome nonetheless. So check them out if you have an interest in watching those, and I'll see you around the old gaming forum.